Hi and welcome to Boston Media Theory. I'm Marcus Breen. This is a program about various people and their theories about media who live and work in Boston. Maybe academics, researchers in research institutions, people who are maybe practitioners or who are looking at how media affects our lives and how we can theorise it and make better sense of it. Today I'm delighted to welcome Associate Professor Murray Forman from Northeastern University, and he's in the program of Media and Screen Studies at Northeastern University. Murray, welcome. And we're here to talk to you about hip-hop and rap music. Music, I guess, in a popular format. You're known certainly very much around Boston and the US and I guess internationally as a hip-hop scholar, which has a series of challenges about it, I'm sure, for many people who might wonder how hip-hop and scholarship gets together, or gets to be together, so we'll talk about that. But I wanted to raise what has to be an important question first, and that is the idea of studying hip-hop and being white, being not in the traditional community from which that cultural formation emerged. What brought you to, as it were, be engaged in research in this area?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of an interesting thing that if you look at the lore and the the history, the beginnings of hip hop, it originated often through Caribbean practitioners, DJs, people hosting parties. Even some of the early rappers came from a Caribbean lineage, Jamaica, Barbados, and the like. And hip hop evolved gradually out of some of the musical forms in New York City and in the Bronx in particular. My encounter with hip hop, while not in New York, and about 10 years later in Ottawa, Canada, also came through the Jamaican influence that I was covering reggae music for a local newspaper. I was playing a lot of reggae on the campus community radio station. And the clubs that hosted the reggae shows were among the first to start hosting hip-hop as well, that they were familiar with the young audiences, they were familiar or comfortable enough with having a lot of young black youth in their venues, and so there was this overlap and connection that way. So I gradually was part of hip-hop at that beginning moment in that particular place, and I was doing it from a media perspective, writing about it, doing interviews, and that sort of thing. So that was sort of my gateway, my entry into a hip-hop world.
Right. So I have to ask you if this would seem to be a Canadian experience, in a sense in which there may be more fluidity or interaction between African American or Caribbean, black, the black community or African American community and others in Canada as opposed to the US perhaps?
Well, I would hesitate to say it was outright Canadian, but like so many of these things, they're more localized than that. Yeah. And so that was the story in that place, in Ottawa, at that moment. And I gravitated from Ottawa to Montreal and saw something somewhat similar, and yet the cultural breakdown with Haitian youth, English-speaking Caribbean youth, French-speaking and English-speaking white youth. Yeah. So it was a linguistic dynamic in that context. So I think these things, rather than nationalizing them, maybe can be understood in these original moments. And every place in the world if there's hip-hop, they have their hip-hop original moment. And I think you'd want to look at what the local infrastructure is, what the localized cultural dynamics are.
Right. And that's a very important point, because it seems to me, and I'm not really very knowledgeable at all about hip-hop, it is that it is very located. It has real geographical sense, doesn't it?
Absolutely does.
In the 90s there was the famous, I think it stopped well and truly, but the famous almost warfare, disagreements between the US West Coast and the East Coast, right? Yeah. That was a big deal.
Yeah, and some of that was media hype, of course, but when people start taking it seriously, and different crews, different acts, people from different labels and different parts of the country would get together, say around awards shows, that they seem to be the cauldrons for some of the trouble. There seemed to be trouble that would emerge when these groups from different areas collided. But even in large cities, it's true. People from the Bronx maybe not connecting in an earlier stage with people from Brooklyn or Staten Island and Queens, right? That they had animosities, or they were, they held to different groups that were highly situated in their communities, in their blocks. You know.
Sure. You moved to the United States, and clearly it would be fair to say that there was a huge wave of change or transformation, somewhat like, I guess, the emergence of rhythm and blues, coming from the black community into mainstream community. Mm-hmm. Did you feel that that was something that you could continue to connect with, and then wanted to kind of develop an academic career around?
Yeah, I mean, sort of give credit to some of the work that was coming out just as I was, developing, I guess, some of my academic chops. And so there was a lot of work. People like George Lipsitz, who was doing sociological theory around issues of race, but also looking at popular music and the way music was a form of expression. So he was looking not just at hip-hop, but looking at rhythm and blues and was it Central Avenue, I think, in Los Angeles, and what that meant as a jazz and R&B center in LA, and what that meant from a racial perspective. He was advisor for Tricia Rose, very influential, I think, in some of her academic development. And she wrote what I would say is probably the number one or the first go-to book on rap and hip-hop, called Black Noise. And that was in 1994.
Right.
And so when that came out, I think an awful lot of us who were studying at the time saw that this is something possible, that she showed a kind of rigor in her research that we all recognized right away, that if you're going to do scholarly work on hip-hop and be true to hip-hop, I think, treat it with the respect and the cultural value that it deserves, that it demands, but also be true to academia and bring that research and theoretical and analytical rigor that it demands. She showed the way, I think, and to this day, pretty much anybody doing what we call hip-hop studies owes her a certain debt of gratitude.
Okay. So I have to ask how a popular art form, and certainly an art form that seems to have been very much of the street, makes a transition into a space that we're in today, Boston media theory. How and what do you do to approach it?
Yeah, one of those lines that academia and maybe Boston media theory needs hip hop more than hip hop needs academia.
Sure. Yeah.
But in some ways, sometimes it feels like a translation effort, right? How do you take something that's alive and culturally vivid and expressive and bring it into an academic realm in a way that won't lose the meanings and won't lose that vitality? And sometimes, as we've probably both learned, bringing high theory to other kinds of cultural activities and expressions can really take the steam out of them. Can really even potentially be damaging them as a kind of appropriation, right? And so I think there's an awful lot of scholars using now what they call critical hip-hop pedagogy. Trying to turn the classroom into what they call a cipher, so that the ideas are bouncing around in real time, as if, like in a rap cipher or a b-boy dance cipher, where you get in the middle and you show what you got. Right. And you bring your skills and you bring it as hard as you can. And when you start winding down, you step back and hand it off and the next person steps in. And I think academia can work like that as well. And I think using theories as thinking and understanding tools can work in this cipher approach. So there's an example, I think, how hip-hop can really work in a classroom, for instance, and maybe bring something to that classroom that is, again, true to hip-hop, but also really generative of new knowledge in the class.
Yeah. Well, what would that new knowledge be?
Well, that remains to be seen. I think maybe discipline by discipline, it depends what you're looking at. So if you put hip-hop into the context, say, of feminist theoretical analysis and feminist studies, you're going to, or gender studies, not just feminism, but the study of masculinities and femininities and the like, you're going to, hip-hop, is going to have different ways of thinking about it, different forms of expression, maybe different text, language, lyrics, that sort of thing, different performance styles, right? So, you put somebody like Missy Elliott, who we just saw in the Super Bowl, and, look at her performance and her lyrics, and what does it mean to be a strong, empowered woman who writes her own lyrics, directs her own material. Similarly with race, similarly with issues of class. In business context, the hip-hop mogul, finance and entrepreneurship. So I think there's a lot to be learned in and through hip-hop, but it depends, where it's situated and what theories and what analysis you bring to it.
Right. Well, you brought along some of the work that you've published. The first one.
Yeah, this is The Hood Comes First, and when you refer to this idea of cultural specificities and location, that was the theme of this book, really. What is the hood? What is this spatial knowledge and the way people experience their surroundings and articulate and express the affect and what that means? And so that was the first project, and then the other book I've got is more of a textbook. That's The Joint, the Hip Hop Studies Reader. This is the second edition here, and this is a collection of about 50 articles and essays that look at, as you're suggesting, that look at hip-hop from any number of angles, around spatiality, around queer identities and gender identities, around entrepreneurship and industry.
Right.
So I think as a textbook, we just tried to show the range of hip-hop studies and the rigor that's going on out there.
Right. Which I presume then reflects something of the transformation that universities have to go through in saying, well, what do we do in terms of providing a liberal arts education,
right,
or even the critical thinking skills around what's happening in society?
Yeah.
Is that a fair summary?
I think it is, although there's a worrisome side to that as well sometimes, that a couple of things, and these are barriers that I've encountered and that a lot of people encounter, and while many have fallen, I think they still exist in a lot of places, certainly places that adhere to a certain conservative or at least traditional notion of what academia is and what cultural value is, right? That in some instances hip-hop, like pop culture perhaps more generally, is deemed unworthy of the university.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Despite the fact that millions upon millions of people participate actively in it, that it does have deep cultural roots that can be traced to various other nations and various other historical moments, they don't see the relevance of it, and they think that it somehow corrodes what the university, what academia should be. And we can look at another side of it and from a maybe neoliberal and a kind of economic perspective, that some administrators see that hip-hop fills seats, fills classrooms, fills lecture halls, and so offering hip-hop courses can be a lucrative proposition.
Really?
And so they don't necessarily care at that level if it's being taught well, if the teachers are somehow committed and true to the culture, if they want to try and create dialogue between the university and the streets, so to speak. They just want to maybe offer something that has a cool cachet that they can capitalize on, and that's exploitation and that's appropriation. So both of those are negatives about this, about bringing hip hop into the university.
Where would you position yourself in your work in terms of media theory? I mean, what is the contribution?
Yeah,
as you see your work?
Right now, well, the project I'm working on right now involves age and aging. What does it mean to grow old in hip-hop? And the theoretical perspective I'm using is not directly media theory. I'm looking at critical age theory, critical gerontology, cultural gerontology.
Yeah, right.
But at the same time, I'm looking at aspects of representation, right? And so some of this might be watching something like, it's off air now, but the reality show Snoop Dogg's Fatherhood.
Okay.
Or Run's House with Run from Run DMC.
Sure.
Watching portrayals and representations of them being adults with their own kids. And so there's a media component there, which involves a study of an analysis of a representational imagery and performance. Discourse analysis and looking at lyrics. And while I don't want to get locked into or too fixated on lyrics, there is something about that. They are telling a certain kind of story. Well, what's the story again? What is the language of representation that maybe tells us about age-based differences, age-based dissonance, those sorts of things. So I'm drawing continually on media theories and on cultural studies theories, the critical perspectives, so that I'm trying to maybe not only reveal or peel away layers that you know, to try and see what else is going on, but try and understand how hip-hop fits into the wider society and wider cultural practices as well.
Right, which is an important contribution, certainly to help students, but also intellectuals in the academic community, people outside of the community, and then hip-hop artists and consumers themselves, if they get to read your work or as you interact with them, to see that there's a significant value in this. It's a common challenge for anybody working across popular culture, not so much media, but popular culture. I mean, cinema and cinema studies has been well received as somewhat grounded in, you know, serious reflections. Not so for areas like popular music, and certainly for hip hop. So it seems that you can bring a significant amount of knowledge to the table, and then have a connection, or have potentially a connection with empowering people. Is that a fair summary? Yeah,
I think so. But again, I wouldn't want to say that the academic work is necessarily going to have that that potential for empowerment. You know. In fact, you know, in hip hop, I wouldn't say that it's rampant, but there are traces of anti-intellectualism, a deep mistrust of academics making claims of empowering communities through our theorization of hip hop, right? So I'm, you know, I don't want to be disingenuous and say that that's, you know, that empowerment is good, and if I'm able to help in some way and contribute, then my work will do that. But in a way, that's not my call to make. If somebody feels empowered, you know, in academia or outside of academia, then that's great. But that's their determination, and I'm not going to try and say, you know, hold up my sword and charge into the fray. No, you know, I'm going to free or empower people's minds, and I'm not sure that that's my mission.
Right, right. So what is it? What is a mission in what I consider a fairly difficult terrain of undertaking research in a field like hip hop?
Yeah, I mean, rap? You know, these days. I'm of split allegiances, I suppose, that I'm, you know, I'm deeply committed and grateful for, and you know, I draw my my livelihood from academia, right? And so I'm a committed scholar, but I'm also committed to hip hop. While I don't have the arts, I'm not a DJ, I'm not an MC, I'm not a b-boy, I don't do airsoft art. But those are the so-called traditional four elements. Right. And the next element that people talk about, the fifth element, is knowledge. Right? And I maintain, and I have for a long time, that reading about hip-hop, writing about hip-hop is a contribution. These are you know, necessary parts of that fifth element of knowledge. Right. And so my commitments are very strong to knowledge about hip-hop, knowledge of hip-hop, to try and build the culture, to try and create connections with other hip-hop scholars and with artists as well. And you know, it's hip-hop language to build. You know, we're in this, we're trying to build community. And so, you know, my mission in a sense is to try and make hip-hop stronger. Right, right. If I can do that, then you know, then I'm satisfied.
Right. And is it connecting to other fields outside of music? I mean, it's very much about a lifestyle, as far as I understand it. How is that working out?
Yeah, I guess, you know, it depends. There's an awful lot of dialogue and work across educational fields. So hip-hop and educators at all levels, from elementary school through middle and high school into the universities as well. That there's a lot of contact. Often, you know, people who've grown up with hip-hop, maybe they're artists themselves, who are teaching at these various levels. And so there's a lot of dialogue between hip-hop and between hip-hop scholars at the university level and educators. People doing social work or working in criminal justice, right? If the young charges that they're working with, or the families and the communities that they're working with, are steeped in hip-hop, then and if it's culturally valuable to them and somehow defines their everyday experiences, then the people who are working with them in some way have to be familiar with what those rhythms are, what those lyrical and language, you know, phrases are, and what their meanings are. So you know, those are two quick examples, and then you can start looking at the performance arts as well. You know, dance, at theater, at filmmaking, right? Hip hop has you know, got deep roots into all of those areas.
Right. And it strikes me that there are very significant contributions that can be made from the kind of theorizing that you were talking about before, whether it's a feminist perspective, taking that a little bit further, of the kind of connection with knowing that of the most challenged and, if you could say, oppressed people in our society as black women, right, or women of colour, then maybe there's a significant and unique contribution, understanding hip-hop culture or understanding black culture through hip-hop, to resort to some solutions or offer and help find some solutions.
Well, I think in what we've seen in this country over the past year, we just start naming names, more than a year, right? How far back do we want to go? But Oscar Grant, through Michael Brown, through Eric Garner, young men who've been frankly murdered or killed by oppressive forces, and irresponsible use of violence. So who rose up, and who were some of the leaders of the activism and the uprisings in those instances? Strong black women at the front of the lines, and leading the discourse in many cases, and also a great number of rappers, of MCs, right? People who make a living using their voice, using their language to move other peoples, to move the crowd in a party context, suddenly found themselves articulating their grievances and their anxiety and sorrow and anger in ways that were very compelling, in ways that were highly responsible, I think, as well. And so hip-hop is central to these evolving stories as well.
Sure, very interesting point. And the significance, I suppose, at another level is the comfort with which one generates a sense of public speaking when you've been a performer. It doesn't take much to become a protester as a performer, or a performer as a protester.
That's right.
Bringing the same voice or similar stories.
And I would say that it's not only that, in the spoken voice, when they're at rallies and that sort of thing, and I've seen a lot of examples of that, or at seminars. I'm thinking of Tef Poe from Ferguson. He's a very talented MC. He was on the streets there regularly and leading some of the criticisms and talking to the media. Shows up at Harvard and does a really convincing explanation of the situation on the ground as he experienced it, and the connections across the country that he's making as an activist and as a hip hop MC. But these guys and these women also write, right?
Oh, really?
They're amazing writers, and so it's not just the verbal dexterity and lyrical performances, but they're writing words that are using different media to circulate more widely, and again, that just makes them, I think, more valuable to the movement and to protest.
I suppose it also provides some kind of challenge to how universities situate themselves within the society and the kind of knowledge they produce and what that knowledge is used for. Activist professors, and I mean that in a positive way, people who teach social activism and uses of media to make progressive social change. They're among some of the folks who are first and perhaps most welcoming of hip hop in these contexts as well. Partly because they're following these things already. How is Twitter and other kinds of social media, Facebook, being used in these protest movements, and they're finding out who these the leadership cadre is, and if there are hip hoppers involved, they're getting invited to campuses. They're speaking to student groups. So it's a fascinating connection to social movements, really. Absolutely. Yes. Now you've got another book that you haven't yet shown us, but is representative of your other or more emerging field. One Night on TV is worth weeks at the Paramount. Popular music on early television. And this is, everybody asks, how do you make a change from, say, Tupac Shakur and Notorious B.I.G. to Perry Como and Peggy Lee? And while it is an abrupt kind of shift, this is a historical project that's been going on. The book came out 2 years ago, but the project was ongoing for about 10 years. So while I was doing my hip-hop scholarship and producing a lot of work on hip-hop, I was just sort of poking away at this other one. But one of the things was to maintain my interest in popular music, but also to expand out of hip-hop and look at other media and all the other historical times. But some of the same issues that I found led me to it. Is that I found an absence in the field, that people talked about
music on television, and the conversation almost always or very often began with Elvis, right? Or maybe Ed Sullivan and the performances that appeared on Ed Sullivan, and there were some great ones. But there was this gap between 1948 and 1956, just not much written about it. And so I thought I would take a shot at that and try and do some good archival work and find a lot of primary sources, industry notes and the like, and so that's what that book is about. Yeah.
All right. I suppose the persistent theme in your career is music, popular music.
It is.
And we should really finish on this note about making a connection between popular music and the kind of lived experiences that people have in Boston. And your observations of the richness or the contribution that music makes to the city. How would you characterize it?
Yeah, Boston's always been a great music city, and I think a lot of times it's a matter of infrastructure, right? Are there good and interesting clubs, and are there enough of them that can support or sustain a scene? Are there good radio stations? And historically, Boston, in terms of its rock stations and freeform FM stations, it was one of the national leaders through the 60s and 70s. And then there's that that interesting thing of universities, young people, lots of them. And so I think that's one of the things that really makes Boston so rich, is that there's so many young people, so many eclectic tastes, and it's a place that bands want to come and play. There's that great line in the movie This Is Spinal Tap, where the rock mockumentary, and they're supposed to do a gig in Boston, and it gets canceled, and their manager says, "Nah, don't worry, Boston, not a big college town." And of course, the irony of it is that this is a great place for popular music, and any act that hopes to make it, and we can look at, point to, U2, the Police, Springsteen, they all really had, moments where their career really took off that had some sort of connection to Boston.
Right. Well, Murray, thank you very much for your contribution.
It's a pleasure.
And that's it for Boston Media Theory for this time. Good night and thanks for watching.